Scenario 3. Local complex needs network. One of the ambitions behind PIES 2 was to help services to move beyond just looking at the extent to which they worked as psychologically informed environments, but the extent to which the system in which they operated at local level was itself psychologically informed in a way that helped them to help work with their service users and others to meet more complex needs that tend to cut across other services and other agencies' work. So let's look now at the extent to which PIES 2 and the PIE Abacus in particular can potentially help in that endeavour. This is still new, this is still exploratory, it's all still an innovation, but let's see how this may be able to work for us in the future. So we are looking at a local complex needs network, and complex needs tend to be complex. So this diagram also looks pretty dense, doesn't it? So let's take it gradually, piece by piece. We're looking at a local area coordination group trying to knit together all the various different services to get a more smooth, seamless pie of pathways. I am suggesting here that there might be 3 or 4 different agencies all involved in supporting this coordination group. Here I've suggested it could be public health, it could be the homelessness division, it could be a community safety partnership, it could be any combination of those, wherever there is the organisation and particularly the motivation to work towards getting better integrated services. So we have a complex needs coordination group that knows that it wants to develop better as a pie of pathways and is wondering how. One of their questions is to what extent the new framework of PIES 2 does contain within it all the elements that they want to look at and bring out. So they've looked at things like the spaces of opportunity, pathways, the system coherence, the surroundings, the networks that services can operate and can provide. They want to see how they can improve sector engagement as part of the learning and inquiry approach within organisations and between them. They think there are probably issues of training and support for the staff of those services in working more in partnership with each other, but also possibly in working with others in training and support to others who aren't just the service staff and their partners. And they're aware that there may need to be some changes in the operating principles, the procedures of particular services. So they want to look at the 3 hours, they want to look at staff and user roles, issues such as liaison roles between agencies, and generally the overall responsiveness of the services and how services see the overall responsiveness of the network itself. So, how are they going to approach it? Well, first of all, if they're interested in using the abacus, they're going to need to appoint or designate a PIES lead for the coordination group. In effect, they are the PIE Abacus lead here, because the first thing they're going to do is discuss and get themselves a license to develop an abacus or a series of abacuses for this local network. There are 3 main groups they want to involve in this consultation, mapping and future planning. One is a whole range of different service providers. The second is the particular user groups. They want to hear how it all looks from the point of view of the service users. And finally, there could be any number of community groups that also want to have a say in how well these services and their interworking relationships, how well these are meeting the needs of the community. This could be the local business innovation district, it could be tenants associations in some parts of the patch, a range of different community groups that might be interested. Well, for the sake of this scenario, let's suggest that there might be 18 different services that are involved. There could be more likely to be many more, but to keep the diagram manageable, we'll look at maybe 18. 6 of these we're going to suggest are already using the abacus for their own progress and self-assessment and service development. They already have a license and they already have their own staff involved in assessing their own service and what they think of the system's coherence and the networks and so on that they are trying to work with. So they've already got their views on spaces of opportunity, they've already got their views on sector engagement and what helps and hinders and what they could do next, and likewise training and support. Maybe they've not necessarily looked at support for other staff, but it's certainly in the mix, it's something they might have looked at. And the 3 R's they've already started to consider. So they're already in a position to input this information with the views of their own frontline staff directly into this new local complex needs network, Abacus. What about the others? We'd suggested 18 services, so there's 12 other services that don't use the Abacus. How are we going to get them involved? Well, the first thing to do is to create an Abacus for these services to feed into. You don't need to. You could have them feeding directly their own views into the central Abacus, but it's probably going to help to have them as a separate pathway in, so you know which views are really based in the lived experience of the staff, for those feeding in through their own Abacus with the frontline staff contributing, and those who are reliant on a smaller number of people saying what they think the agency itself is up to. So for those, they're going to need one person representing the agency who contributes as best they can the views of that service. It could be based on all kinds of other Pizazz discussions or away day consultations. I'm not saying it's necessarily superficial or wrong, it's just not yet geared up to input directly into the local area PIE Abacus. But you've got one scribe, one person designated as the person who will input the information, inputting that into the secondary Abacus specifically for the services who want to contribute and can't contribute directly. Now, they also want to look at the service user groups. I've suggested here 8 service user groups. Of course, it could be any number. And in order to encourage and to get them to contribute into this piece of software that's a little bit daunting for those who aren't necessarily literate at all, let alone computer literate, they want to bring in the local advocacy service who will support and assist in facilitating getting the user's views of services. So they create an Abacus, again, specifically to get the user group voice, to hear how that may differ from other opinions, and with the support of the advocacy service, the service user groups can now feed into that. We also wanted to have the views of the community groups, the community representation groups, and so once again we'll create a separate Abacus for them, all within the same single agency license. And that allows the community rep groups to feed in to the central Abacus. They may also want some support in facilitating, somebody to help them. Could be somebody perhaps from the advocacy service or from public health itself, wanting to support and develop that kind of engagement. But they're not really going to need to have each individual able to put the hands-on data input of their own views. For them as well, for the service user representation groups, one person who scribes on behalf of a group discussing the issues is going to be quite sufficient. And in fact, anything other than having a scribe might seem a bit intimidating. You don't want to be singled out as individuals. And probably simpler too for the community rep groups to appoint or be assigned one person scribing on their behalf. Now, this is for the overall picture of how they work as a PIE, but it's already pretty clear that partnership and the ability to work in partnership and the extent to which we can and what difficulties there are between the service provider agencies is going to be an issue. So they've decided already, perhaps they've had a preliminary conversation and thought it through with some discussions, but they've decided to create 3 additional subgroup forums for particular aspects of this. One might be confidentiality protocols, another one might be the kind of risk assessments that people share. There could be all kinds of difficulties that need to be addressed and which you pick out only via having that discussion. And what happens then is that all those agencies are now able to feed their own views on those specific issues, specifically into those subgroup forums set up to discuss those particular parts of the network and the system coherence. And they can then feed all of that information in to the central abacus. So this is how you can develop additional abacuses for specific focuses and forum areas. And let's quickly look now at the number of individual users you are going to need to manage this. You have one license, you've as many abacuses as suits the way of working and the concerns and the organizational structure. How many people are you going to need as users? Well, the complex needs coordination group, they're going to need their own staff, or many of their staff, to be able to read, let alone input themselves. So let's assume that there's maybe half a dozen or so who need to be included and named as users in their own right. There may be others in public health and homelessness and so on, the higher echelons, who also want to be able to read and view, but it's perfectly plausible that they don't really need to actually be users themselves. The kind of written reports that the abacus can produce for them may well be all they need. So let's not include them at this stage, although we can always bring them in later. The community representation groups, well, we know there's 12 groups, and so there's going to be 12 scribes and 12 users in addition who have to be included in the license. And likewise, 8 for the service user groups, and let's say for the advocacy service we'll have another 3 users, because they are the ones working with them and wanting to be able to input perhaps their own views and observations, probably independently, but for the moment we'll include them in that group. We then have the 12 services that needed their own individual scribe, so they're also going to need 1 extra license code issued to them. As for the 6 agencies already using the Abacus license, no, they already have licenses and license codes. They can share their data already with anybody who also has an Abacus and a license code. So no additional users needed there. And when we look at the subgroup forums to look at partnership issues that we'd suggested they might need earlier on, again, all the people feeding into that now have a license code of their own. You don't need any additional users. Those 12 that we'd originally counted up, that's all we need. And the same will be true if, for example, for the advocacy services or the partnership community groups, you wanted to add in further subgroups. Again, because they're all users contained within the same license, there's no additional cost for their involvement. So add it all up together and we're looking at maybe 40 or so just with this purely notional network. In practice, I'm sure there'll be many more than 18 services in any one locality, but to keep the numbers relatively simple and to keep the diagram simple enough, we're looking at maybe 40 or so, 40 plus. Well, even if you wanted to add in a little extra for the top brass, for the local councillors perhaps, or any others, you might be looking at 50. So you're still looking at pretty manageable numbers. And now they have the abacus, not only are they feeding in their views on those issues, but they're also asked to go through all 5 stages, certainly the first 4, of looking at their initial assessment, providing the evidence on which they base that assessment, the strengths and weaknesses. They're all asked, again, to say what they think helps, what are the strengths in the area, what works, and what hinders, what holds it all back. And from that, to suggest an action plan, including what their own involvement in that might be. It might be, of course, just to point out to the powers that be what they think somebody else needs to do, but there is the space there for them to be more proactive and more positively contributing. And I think perhaps in relation to the community representation groups, for example, that might be a really interesting set of questions to ask and to address. But before we move on to the next scenario, let's pause briefly and look again at step 5 in the stages of the Pizazz self-assessment and development program. Step 5 we've described as peer review, so that those who are self-assessing are still accountable in some way to their peers, another community of practice that can give you sometimes useful, sometimes challenging, sometimes highly supportive feedback on how you think you're doing. In this example, with a complex needs network run with a partnership at local level, a coordination group, there are other local networks, either in local authorities or in other spheres, with a similar ambition to coordinate better the complex needs cross-cutting services. If they also find the abacus useful in their work, it's then perfectly possible to create an abacus for those network services, a place, a way that you can communicate and share your practice and your judgments with each other. This is moving outside your own service into another field. This becomes ways in which we can use the abacus to develop communities of practice across a much wider range. And that's what we're going to look at in the next video. So, to what extent the abacus really does underpin a kind of local, complex needs mapping and engagement exercise remains to be seen. We can see the potential in the abacus for providing that coherence, providing that common language between services, and providing a constructive process by which we can identify strengths and weaknesses without it turning into an argument and getting hot under the collar and so on. How far this will really work, as we can anticipate, it is far too soon to say. But this is the ambition, and this was always the ambition behind introducing those spaces of opportunity, systemic sector engagement, and system coherence parts of the PIE 2 framework. It's a big ambition, but then what's the point of an ambition if it's not ambitious? In some of the forthcoming scenarios, we'll be looking at other ways that you can reach outside the organisation into developing communities of practice, into looking at research, and a number of other possibly more technical questions. But this, for the moment, is a good place to pause.